Fun fact, this book was originally called Where the Crayfish Make a Weird Tapping Noise, but apparently that wasn't poetic enough. Where the Crawdads Sing is a coming-of-age romance, mystery, courtroom drama about a young woman who lives in isolation in the marsh and is accused of murder. This book was very popular when it came out a couple of years ago, garnering several 5-star reviews and being praised as a heartbreakingly beautiful story with depth and meaning, helped no doubt by endorsement from Reese Witherspoon, who is actually producing the film adaptation set to be released in June this year. The book is split into 2 stories, told simultaneously across 2 time periods before merging for the climax. The first story begins in 1952 and follows Kaya Clark, a 6-year-old girl who is left to survive with only her abusive father in a shack in the marsh after her mother and siblings walk out on her one by one. As is obvious from the blurb, the dad also leaves her. Alone, Kaya forges a life for herself in the marsh and the animals who live there, withdrawing almost completely from human contact. The second story begins in 1969, where 2 police detectives, who I think are actually a sheriff and a deputy, investigate the murder of Chase Andrews, a handsome man who was especially popular with the ladies despite being married, and suspicion quickly falls on Kaya. Perhaps it was because of the hype and high praise surrounding the book, or perhaps I'm just a grumpy sod, but I didn't care for it. I actually really struggled reading the first third of this book, and I had to force myself to keep going until the plot picked up around 100 pages in. I was also misled by the blurb, which to me implied that the plot begins with the murder mystery and then Kaya's story occurs afterwards, but in actual fact it's the other way around. I don't know if my opinion of this book would have been different if I hadn't heard about it before, but I also don't think I would have picked it up if it weren't for my landlady lending me this book because she thought I'd enjoy it. Apparently she was wrong. Delia Owens, the author, is a wildlife scientist, so as you may guess from that, the descriptions of the marsh's flora and fauna are pretty good. Some of it is a little over-egged, but there are some genuinely really nice bits. I also liked the use of food in Kaya's sections, to an extent. I think it did a good job of showing the difference in lifestyle and attitudes between her and other characters. But again, it is over-egged rather. It is mentioned a lot. I also like the specificity of the foods mentioned, grits, turnip greens, cornbread, hush puppies. I did have to look up a couple of things because they're quite American, but it would have, I think, broken the immersion to explain them to readers, so I didn't mind looking them up. I liked the overall shape of the story and some of the themes and comparisons Owens drew from nature and human nature, and although I struggled for the first part of the book, when the plot picked up I was a lot more invested. Finally, there was a cat. Awkwardly, I didn't realise the cat was a cat at first. When Sunday Justice was described as a courtroom cat with black hair keeping the building free of rats, for some reason I just thought that was a very metaphorical description of a person. So when the bailiff or someone started petting his head, I was really confused. I think it was because they said hair instead of fur. Yeah, but there was a cat and the cat was excellent, so best character, 10 out of 10. Firstly, the prose, it was quite clumsy at times and very style over substance in my opinion. Lots of fragmented sentences that didn't serve any purpose, and some of the descriptions were a little bit much. I also really hated the use of phonetic spellings and dialect in the prose. I sort of understand it in the dialogue, but sometimes it would sneak into the actual narration, which was jarring and just not great. There were also a lot of pointless details that were thrown in, like what food the detectives were eating or going to eat at the diner, and what clothes Kaya was wearing to town that day, which was just tiresome and I didn't need it. The dialogue was very tedious. Again, there were a lot of phonetic spellings and dialect issues, and I understand why some authors would write dialogue in that way. I personally don't like it because it can come across as quite mocking to accents and ways of speaking. But also it's really difficult to read. So I really struggled reading the dialogue because I had no idea what they were saying half the time. It's also very inconsistent, with some characters speaking in a very exaggerated accent, specifically the nasty characters and the black characters. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that. And honestly, the dialogue was just very dire in general. It was unnatural, stilted, and sort of forced. A lot of speech felt like As you know, John. Which isn't what you want. And there were also instances of lines floating untethered in the middle of the prose, usually with Kaya's sections, which made it sound like she was just sort of talking to herself out loud. A, that's weird. B, it was unnecessary, as all those bits of dialogue were things that we knew or could glean from the narration. It was like the book was just whacking you on the head and going, do you understand? Did you get that? She's alone. She's isolated. She's lonely. So that was just really tiring. Pacing and structure. The pacing was quite stilted and the book clumsily structured. The first part is boring because Kaya is just like eating grits and waxing lyrical about how she's all alone. And the detective sections were so sporadic that I struggled to follow their investigation. The pacing did pick up when Kaya got older and forged relationships with other characters. My biggest issue with the structure wasn't the constant flipping between the two stories, because I don't mind non-linear narration, but the constant flashbacks. Flashbacks in the middle of scenes that were too numerous, too long, and just didn't need to be there. They completely took you out of the moment to deliver information that wasn't necessary and then dump you back in where you were disoriented. All of these flashbacks should either have been shortened to a couple of lines, made into their own scenes, or taken out entirely. I also really hated the head hopping in this. I don't care for it as a technique anyway, but it was particularly jarring in this. Just stay in one character's head and only switch when you start a new section or scene or chapter. Like, don't jump in the middle of a conversation. It's very confusing. The characters were very stereotypical and cliched. Kaya is mysterious and wild and alone. Tate is the kind boy who enters her world and helps her reach her full potential. Chase is the bad boy who girls keep falling for because he's cute, I guess. The dad's an alcoholic. The sheriff and the deputy are bumbling idiots. We have Jumpin' and Mabel, who basically encompass the magical Negro trope, just without the magic. It's all very caricaturish, which makes their actions and therefore the story very predictable. The logic is definitely off. A lot of people have pointed out issues with the geography, with characters going to the city of Asheville for things like bicycles and ties, which is the other side of the county, I think, when there are other cities that are far closer. It's also very difficult to believe that all of Kaya's family would leave her alone at the age of 6 with the abusive father. And yet they're all still painted in a good light, especially the mum and the brother Jody. Like, none of them took her with her when she's 6. People don't act like that. You wouldn't leave a 6-year-old child in that situation. And the people in both the white town and the coloured town don't do a thing to help her, with the exception of Jumpin' and Mabel. And even then, they don't really do that much. And yet this woman, Kaya, who grew up alone in the marsh, actively avoiding people and rarely speaking, somehow managed to get not one but 2 men to fall in love with her almost immediately. No. Kaya also learns remarkably quickly. I don't mind characters who can learn quickly, and I think some of her skills are understandable, but the rate at which she learns and improves is really unbelievable. She doesn't learn to read until the age of 14, and yet within a very short amount of time she's reading complex science textbooks that would be advanced for her age even if she did go to school. And it doesn't stop there, but I'll get more into that later. She also has this very odd habit of reciting full poems out loud to herself at random times. Not like thinking about a particular line or verse, or reading them out loud from a book. No, these are poems that she has learned off by heart and will randomly recite in their entirety whilst, like, driving her motorboat or something. If I started doing that, people would think I was some pretentious snob. And sometimes Owens ends the poems... I rhymed. With by Amanda Hamilton or A.H., which implies that Kaya literally said that bit out loud as well, which I found very funny. The poems also suck, which doesn't help, and could have been cut out with little effect on the plot. I also found this book, I don't want to say sexist, but there were very few female characters. Kaya, who's not like other girls, which to me feels like the sexist version of saying one of the good ones to a black person. Mabel, a woman only described as being black and fat. The mum, who left her children with an abusive man in the beginning and is never seen again. and a selection of women from the village. Some are nasty, stuck up, and treat Kaya like dirt, whereas others aren't evil but still left this literal child to fend for herself in the marsh. Some aren't named and are instead given nicknames by Kaya like Always Wears Pearls, Tall Skinny Blonde, and Round Chubby Cheeks, which I found quite deprecating. And odd because Mabel did say something about the importance of having a group of girlfriends to rely on, but the only group of girlfriends we see are the girls that Kaya gives these vapid nicknames to, whilst Kaya basically surrounds herself only with men because apparently it's only men that are good enough to try to understand the strange, mysterious, beautiful girl in the marsh. Oh yeah, Kaya is very beautiful. Which I'm not going to say that people who live in the marsh aren't beautiful, but I mean, her hair is going to be a mess. She's going to be a lot grubbier than people in the town. Her clothes are going to also be grubbier and really shouldn't fit her as well as they do. She lurks in the bushes like an animal and runs around barefoot and eats squished mussels on crackers. But whenever anyone sees her, it's like her hair is so long and beautiful and sumptuous, and her waist is wasp thin, and her breasts are firm, and her eyes are large and black, and it just has the flavour of like the noble savage about it, which is weird because Kaya is white, the same race as everyone else in the town. But because she lives in the marsh, she's so mysterious and weird and savage and terrible. But she's so beautiful, so obviously the marsh people can't be that bad if they produce such a beautiful woman. Her beauty is described a lot by both other characters and by the narration, to the point where it sort of becomes her main characteristic. Beautiful. Because apparently we can't have a protagonist who's just plain, or heaven forbid, ugly. I also found it pretty awkward at the end where this one character calls out the town for treating her with prejudice instead of helping the poor, lonely girl living a lonely existence in her lonely marsh. Alone. Which, she's beautiful, is able to hold intelligent conversation, wears fairly standard clothes, is white. Why is she so ostracised? There's no reason for it. And more pressingly, this is North Carolina in the 1960s, when the USA was very, very racist. Like, there's literally the place called Colored Town nearby, where all the black people live. They have, like, separate churches, and, like, the black people can only sit in a small balcony in the courtroom if the white people don't need it. You know the drill. They are called nasty words and insulted on the street and can't defend themselves because of their placement in society. And we're focusing on the prejudice against the beautiful white person living in the marsh who doesn't actually seem to suffer that much prejudice. There are some small scenes, but honestly, because she keeps to the marsh, we don't see it that much. And only really by the girls she gives the vapid nicknames to and some stuck-up fancy women. And again, notice how it's only the women. So yeah, she was sort of coded as an ostracised non-white person, what with the town not liking her, unlikely to execute justice fairly because the situation is beyond her control, blaming her for problems, seeing her as less than human. All the while she's a beautiful white woman and there is an actual town full of actual ostracised non-white people next door. There's a stupid scene where the detectives go to Kaya's shack to look for evidence tying her to the case, and one keeps getting distracted with her extensive collection of feathers and bones and stuff and keeps reading out facts from her books and notes. In another book, I'd say maybe this was supposed to be funny, but the book makes no other attempts at humour, so it just made him look an idiot who can't focus on a murder case. Remember how I said Kaya's unbelievability gets worse? Having learnt to read at the age of 14 and without formal education, she goes on to write and publish several scientific books about the marsh, which makes her a ton of money, and she becomes her publisher's favourite author. And I wouldn't have minded if she was just the artist. Tate inspires her to write the books after seeing her paintings, and I do buy that she could be very good at art, having spent a lot of her life quietly observing. But to write the book as well and get a £5,000 advance? An unknown author writing a science book about the flora of some very specific marsh? That's not how it works. There are also a few other stupid revelations as well. Remember all those stupid poems she kept reciting? They were hers. Amanda Hamilton is her pseudonym. The poems are terrible, which to be fair is acknowledged by Tate, but it was still pretty stupid. Like, so much is kept back from the read about Kaya, despite her being the main character and us following her through most of the chapters, being in her head, privy to her most private thoughts, seeing at her highest and her lowest. And apparently she was writing all this poetry and it wasn't even hinted at just so we could have this shock reveal at the end. The climax of the book is this court case, and this is where all the stuff the detectives talk about is repeated. The dialogue is pretty tedious, really, which I understand. As someone who's done jury duty, court stuff is boring. But it really was like a chilled Sauvignon Blanc, cold and dry. The lawyers were cardboard cutouts of the good lawyer who came out of retirement and the oily, nasty lawyer who wears stupid ties. The dialogue was tedious and we don't have much of a connection to the scenes. Kaya withdraws in on herself, speaking and thinking nothing, just staring out the window. And we didn't have another character to view the scene through, so it felt very detached, almost like a transcript. But there was a cat, so. The courtroom is also where the good lawyer makes a speech about how prejudiced the town is against Kaya and how bad they were for abandoning her in the marsh and all that. Again, there are black people suffering actual prejudice in attendance, but I guess it's only the pretty white girls who stand up for in this book. The court case basically outlines how unlikely it is that Kaya is responsible for Chase's death, as she has an alibi, being in a different town at the time. Which honestly, the case should never have gotten to court. It should have been thrown out long before that, because she's got an alibi, but... Anyway, she's ruled as not guilty, lives with Tate in her shack, nicely renovated thanks to the book money, and then dies several decades later. And then on the last page, Tate finds out not only that she was actually the poet Amanda Hamilton, but also she did murder Chase. So having just read a whole court case about how she didn't because it was so unlikely, it was her after all, even though she has never sought revenge or showed violent tendencies, she just watched a female firefly and a female praying mantis entice males over with their feminine wiles before eating them and thought, yes, that's a good idea. This is in retaliation to Chase attempting to, like, violate her, by the way. And I wouldn't have minded it as a twist, but I just wish her characterization had supported this throughout the rest of the book. And finally, having found out some stuff about Delia Owens does kind of taint this twist a bit. So Delia and her ex-husband Mark did some work out in Africa in the 80s, trying to protect elephants from poachers. I don't have a problem with that. I love elephants. However, part of their technique did involve arming their side and killing poachers. And this was in Zambia, where there is no shoot-to-kill policy, which allows people to shoot poachers on sight. So it was illegal. Unfortunately for the Owenses, there was a film crew making a documentary about them, and on camera they caught a poacher being murdered by Owens people, possibly by Mike himself, but the two people shooting were blurred out. What I will say is that the Zambian authorities caught wind of this and very much wanted to speak to the Owenses about this murder, because that's what it is, like it or not. But alas, they had fled back to the US and never returned. So for Delia, who whilst not having murdered anyone, seems to have been complicit in murder, to then write a book about someone murdering someone for the sake of justice and getting away with it, it's just awkward. In conclusion, I didn't enjoy this book. I didn't think it was well written, it contained a lot of lazy and harmful tropes, and whilst I liked the plot, its execution was sorely lacking. But the cat was great. That's all I've got to say. See you next time. Bye.